Hi, my name is Mackenzie Pear, and this inquiry presentation is on the impacts of family engagement on student literacy development. This inquiry was centered on elementary students' literacy developments in relation to family engagement and involvement within and outside of the school. This study involved a classroom in which I taught 4th grade English language arts at an elementary school in Pinellas County, Florida. I taught 2 sections, each with 20 kids, totaling 40 students in all. Of the 40 students, 15 between the 2 groups participated in this study. My role in this context is the literacy instructor implementing strategies for increasing literacy performance, and for this study, finding ways to increase family engagement to determine the impact it may have on students' performance. Through my inquiry, I explored the problem of literacy development and achievement for elementary students, specifically focusing on the influences of family engagement and involvement. I chose this inquiry because my students were showing significant deficiencies in reading in class. I wanted to determine if through structured family involvement activities both in and out of school, students' performance in reading may improve. Prior to implementing any changes related to family engagement in literacy, I noticed that less than 50% of my students were performing at grade level reading expectations. I determined that because of this, intervention needed to take place to increase these numbers. I also noticed a major lack of involvement at home in regard to students reading. The expectations for students were to read any book of their choice for 30 minutes or more each night and have their parent or guardian sign their agenda acknowledging that they did so. I was finding that this was not enough family involvement in relation to students reading. Therefore, this problem needed to be tackled through more structured reading experiences with families and students. Because of the problems I was noticing in lack of family engagement and low reading performance scores from my students, I began brainstorming possible ways to improve the outcomes. I initially was hoping to implement family literacy nights at the school in which families could attend an after-school event periodically to engage in reading experiences with their child, but time did not allow for that at this time. However, I still wanted to find ways to address these 3 questions I had. 1, I wanted to know in what ways does greater family involvement in student reading activity impact 4th grade students' literacy performance? 2, what happens to 4th grade students' reading scores when families participate in school-based reading events? And 3, how can I scaffold student learning objectives through teacher-family team collaboration? There were 4 main ways I collected data during this study. The first method of data collection was through continuous field notes throughout the study. I took anecdotal observations of the participating students in class over the 5 weeks that I was collecting data. The field notes focused on their interactions with reading materials, such as the time spent continually reading without distraction and interests in their reading material. Here's a snapshot of some of the field notes I took. I organized this information into an Excel spreadsheet by each week and each student. Most students, I only had time to write down 1 or 2 notes per week. The next method of data collection was the method that I used to gauge whether there was an impact by increasing family engagement. This method required that my students completed a running record with me weekly. Running records are short one-on-one assessments with the instructor in which students are given a leveled passage and asked to read the first 100 words aloud to the teacher. As they read, the teacher marks errors the student makes. After reading the entire passage, the student is asked comprehension questions. The final score of the running record is an average of their scores from accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. This will then determine whether the leveled text they read was at their frustration level, meaning too difficult for them at this time, independent level, or instructional level. For this study, I focused on analyzing students' independent level to determine if there were impacts. I also had students and parents complete surveys. The initial survey was to determine participation. This survey required parents to answer questions using Likert scales to explain their current experiences with their child during reading. Here's a list of the questions that the parents responded to. As you can see, the students answered very similar questions. On the parent survey, they were also able to determine which participation group they wanted to be part of. They could be level 1, where they would be asked to read with their child daily for 10 minutes, Level 2, where they would be asked to read with their child 3 times a week for 10 minutes, or Level 3, where they did not want to participate in any additional reading. In addition to this survey, students completed weekly check-in surveys as well. This was information I gathered to better understand individual experiences of the participants throughout the study. Finally, I had the students and parents track their reading using reading logs. The reading log listed the leveled text they were given by me, the amount of time they spent reading, a summary of what was read, and a signature from the parent. I reviewed these logs to ensure that students and parents in the Level 1 group were reading daily for 10 minutes, and those in the Level 2 group were reading at least 3 times a week for 10 minutes. When analyzing the data I collected, I focused on 2 things. The first and most important consideration that I felt would truly gauge whether or not increased family engagement has an impact on students' reading performance was by tracking students' running record data. I organized this data using a bar chart. I inserted this data into an Excel spreadsheet where I created a column for each student followed by 5 columns for each week running records were assessed. Because running records are scored using an alphabetical scale, I aligned each letter of the alphabet to its numerical value to analyze the data more clearly. This provided me with quantitative data that I could use to answer my overarching question of whether increased family engagement with reading activities at home can impact students' reading performance at school. I then paired that data up with the qualitative data provided by the weekly survey students took, in which they answered the same 6 questions for 4 weeks. I combined that data into the number of responses per Likert scale category over the span of the 4 weeks. I then organized the data using a bar chart to visualize the total responses for each question. Because there were 15 students participating over 4 weeks of surveys, each question had 60 responses that were totaled to figure out what the most common responses for each question was. I organized this information by inputting each question by the number of scale scores 1 through 5. I then tallied the number of responses over the 5 weeks per each scale score. I also reviewed field notes and reading log entries to compare their alignment with the running record and Likert scale data. I did not notice any major or noteworthy discrepancies. Therefore, I did not feel that data from those methods was necessary to include in the results of this study. There were 2 main methods of data collection that provided the results of this inquiry. The first was the data provided by the weekly running record assessments. This data showed me that of the 15 students who participated in the study, only 8 showed any change in their performance on running records. And of those 8 that showed changes, each was only by 1 level over the 5-week time frame. Furthermore, those who showed changes in their running record levels were those already performing below grade level. No student performing at grade level, which would be a level P or a 16 on the chart, moved levels at all. However, 2 students went from below grade level to meeting grade level at some point during the 5 weeks. Secondly, I analyzed the results of the weekly student surveys to better understand personal experiences from each student. They were given the same 6 questions each week for me to understand perceptions and track any changes. When analyzing this to view its impact on the questions of this study, I focused on the overall number of responses for each question over the 4 weeks of surveys. I noticed that in general, most students stated that they enjoyed reading at school, and while they also stated the same about reading at home, there were less who felt strongly about that statement. The responses to their enjoyment of the leveled text provided by me weekly showed less distinguishable excitement and more neutral feelings, which was also the response to feeling good while reading. Students also felt neutral in general about the difficulty level of the books they were assigned. This showed me that they felt the books were not too difficult or too easy, which means they were appropriate levels for the students. However, perhaps more difficult books may have been implemented to help encourage some productive struggle in their reading. And finally, in general, students felt they had enough books to read at home provided by me. In general, the outcome of this inquiry project led me to the results that I expected. While I think the topic of this inquiry is important and my research was valuable, I also felt that there wouldn't likely be negative results provided through increased family engagement. Crosby and colleagues discussed that when providing specific and tangible resources for families with dedication and commitment by both the school and the family, the early reader can improve in their literacy performance greatly. I think that this intervention of additional literacy resources for students and families was the largest impact on this study. However, if time were to allow for it, I would investigate family literacy initiatives such as literacy nights or literacy programs, which would encourage further family involvement and participation. I also think that the inquiry may have benefited from more strategic and thoughtful ways to recruit families to participate, like Doyle and Zhang suggested. I truly gained a lot of experience and insight from this inquiry project. I learned a lot about myself as an educator, but also a lot about the children and families I support. I found throughout this study that I often had to recenter myself to focus on the study to ensure that I was not persuading the data I was collecting. I also learned that there are many ways to engage families in literacy development of their children, and that this study was very narrow in exploring that. Additionally, each student is different, and the responses that one student will have to greater family involvement may be different than another. A major consideration that this project did not consider was the home life of the children. The study was centered on the families deciding whether or not they would participate in additional reading experiences with their children, and lacked understanding of what that might actually look like for the child. Also, there was potentially too much room for faulty data based on the reading logs, as there was very minimal accountability for the child or the parent. All of this considered, I feel I learned a lot that can influence my approaches to literacy instruction and especially literacy intervention. After collecting data from this study, I've learned some important things about family engagement and literacy. My main purpose of this study was to determine if increasing involvement from families in reading activities could have an impact on students' reading performance. I ultimately wanted to know if having parents involved in the reading process, students could improve their reading abilities. I don't feel I have fully determined the answer to that question, but I do have some insight now that I didn't before. My hypothesis was that if parents were more involved in reading activities with their children, the children perform higher in reading. I assume this would make the most sense in the development of the children's reading skills. I wouldn't say that this assumption was wrong, but would say it was unnecessary. I think that my assumption may have influenced the way I viewed this inquiry. Because my main method of analysis for this was based on scores on the weekly running record assessments, I do believe there was a minor impact that family involvement had. However, there were some major impacts that influenced this. For instance, there was simply not enough time to obtain reliable and valuable data. This study really needed to be months long rather than weeks. I did notice some minor improvements from students, especially lower performing students, over the short time frame though. This leads me to believe that if this study were implemented longer term, perhaps greater implications could be provided. Another result of this study was the insight into the experiences and thoughts related to them for the students. I had an idea of which students appeared to like or dislike reading in general based on observations in the class throughout the year, but some students' responses on their weekly surveys surprised me. Some students appeared to enjoy the opportunity to read at home with their parents every night or every few nights, while others had the opposite experience. Some students showed they disliked it because they felt it was just another expectation for them and they didn't see the value of it. Overall, this inquiry provided me with a good understanding of some impacts that family engagement and reading can have on students in the classroom, but I need more information to make final decisions.